Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this evening. This is so great. As you're joining in, if you'd like, please feel free to say in the chat where you're from and any interest you have in seeds or just where you're from. It's always fun to see where people are across the country. I am Sarah Kolber. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Federation's Gardening for Wildlife program, and I'm just west of Ottawa. And I love seeing where people come or join us from across the country. Let's see, Milton, Perry Sound. That's great. Hey, guys. New Brunswick, Simcoe, BC. Okay, Regina, Quebec. This is awesome. See, I love it all over the place. Now they're going too fast for me to read, but this is great. You guys can perhaps read while I go through a bit of housekeeping for this evening. So remember also for the chat to say to everyone, choose to everyone. If you choose to the host and panelist, it just goes to Stefan and myself. So make sure you choose everyone when you say where you're coming from, or if you have anything to share with the group. And we're going to do questions and answers at the end of tonight's webinar. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. And if you're new to Zoom, just take your mouse and hover it around, and then you'll see that near the chat option is also a Q&A option. So if you click that and you write your question there, then at the end of the webinar, I can just go to that one spot and ask the questions there for Stefan. So that's one more thing. And oh, it's going to be recorded, or it is being recorded. So no need to worry about taking notes tonight unless you want to. But at some point this week, I'm not quite sure exactly when we'll get it done. Nova Scotia, Regina, that's great. Thanks for keeping on adding that in, people. This is great. Yeah, so there will be an email that goes out later this week with the recording of tonight's webinar, as well as any helpful links that Stefan or I think might be of use to you folks. So that is something to watch for in a few days' time. And I think what we're going to do is, I love this. Thank you so much for adding in the chat where you're from. It's always so great. So I'm going to keep on moving though now. Let's see. Yes, so tonight's presentation, Adventures in Seed Saving, which is one of the topics that I love. I love collecting seeds and often have done it with my daughter over the years with beneficial annuals and herbs and native plants too. So this is something I'm really looking forward to listening to with our special guest, Stefan Weber. So I did mention I'm Sarah Kolber with the Canadian Wildlife Federation's Gardening for Wildlife program. And CWF is a national charitable organization that has been working to support our wildlife and wild spaces for over 60 years now. And just to do a land acknowledgement, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and that I respect the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous people across this land, which is, I think, a very nice tie-in with the Gardening for Wildlife program, because here we are in all the different corners of this beautiful country, doing our best to respect nature, support nature, and the Indigenous people have been known for eons to, love Mother Nature and be wise in what they take and how much they take and how they use things and how they give back. So here we are coming together doing our best as well. So tonight, without further ado, I'm very, very happy to have you here for Adventures in Seed Saving with our special guest, Stefan Weber. Stefan is a botanist, gardener, and currently coordinates the National Native Seed Strategy Project with CWF that you'll hear about tonight. He's worked previously with the Toronto Botanical Garden, University of Guelph Herbarium, and St. William's Nursery. Stefan has been teaching about seeds and advocating for seed conservation since 2015 through the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance and the Ontario Biodiversity Council. He's conducted research on plant ecology and evolution, receiving his PhD from McMaster University in 2021. He's also a botanical illustrator, occasionally moonlights as a florist, and is most proud of having been a consultant for Ken Appel's botanical horror novel, Bloom. So quite a neat repertoire there, and I'm going to hand it over to you now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And for anyone who's interested, that's actually a native plant called shooting star that's just been going to seed recently in our wildlife-friendly demonstration gardens at our headquarters in Canada.
All right, I think I've shared my screen. Thanks so much for that introduction, Sarah, and thanks for everybody joining tonight. I'm really excited to see so many people. Um, so I've jammed a lot into this presentation because I really like talking to people about plants. We're going to talk a little bit about gardening, I guess, but we're mostly going to talk about plant conservation and thinking about plants as wildlife and what that means for growing seed. Um, so here's just a diagram showing all the wonderful benefits that native plants provide us, from habitat for wildlife to food and medicine to social and community connections. Just a quick overview of my talk tonight. I'm going to introduce myself slowly by talking about my experience farming biodiversity and native plants. I'm going to talk, like I said, about plant conservation and viewing plants as wildlife through handling their seed. And then I'll talk a little bit about the National Native Seed Strategy project that I've been working on recently with Canadian Wildlife Federation. All right. So plants, as you probably know, are the foundation of all terrestrial ecosystems. They're the base of all food chains on land. Canada is home to about 4,000 vascular plants alone, so not including mosses, things like that. And about 30% of these plants, about 1 in 3, are edible or medicinal. And this is an incredible reason, just those two reasons alone, to think about plant conservation across Canada, which is often overlooked. So I'm calling in from Niagara region, um, St. Catharines specifically, and I'm very lucky to have a garden for the past 3 years, a garden to call my own. And I love planting native plants and watching all of the life that comes to my backyard. Here's some fantastic shots that I took of my chaos garden in August, and full of bees, full of butterflies, full of pollinators, full of birds using the plants for food. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm not really going to be talking about gardening too much tonight, other than growing plants for seeds. I'm not really going to be talking about designing gardens or picking the right plants for your garden, although I would love to. That's not really going to be the topic for tonight, although that's always a good reason to plant native plants in your garden. They support wildlife in a very intimate way. So they're the foundation of biodiversity on land, meaning that the relationships that other organisms have with plants generate biodiversity on the landscape. Insects, for example, form specialized relationships with plants, and over evolutionary time, this has generated hundreds of additional species. Just in bees alone, there's about 400 species of native bee in southwestern Ontario. Many of them have special relationships. So that turtlehead plant can only be pollinated by native bumblebees, and this butterfly can only lay its eggs on turtlehead. So through this native plant, the butterfly and the bumblebee are now connected in this sort of food web, in this ecology. And that's what I mean when I say plants are the foundation of these ecosystems. And this kind of relationship is mirrored many times in nature. There's all kinds of insects, the giant swallowtail, that rely on just a handful of native plants to complete their life cycle. This one relies on prickly ash and hop tree. And this is Canada's largest butterfly. It's about this big. Looks like a hamster with wings. This is one of my favorites. It's a primrose moth. I'll let you read this charming quote from 1892. The moth does lay its eggs only on evening primrose. It visits the flowers at night to get nectar, but most biologists agree that it doesn't do a very good job in actually pollinating the flower. So it's a very one-sided, specialized relationship. And it's not just butterflies and moths. There's also specialist bees. Here's one from Southern Ontario, a Monarda bee. It's very, very tiny. And that white spot on her stomach is the pollen of bergamot. And she can only feed her young the pollen of bergamot flowers. And she lives a solitary life. And what's even more remarkable is that her lifetime range is only about 300 meters. So if there isn't a patch of bergamot every few hundred meters on the landscape, this rare species quickly blinks out. So as Sarah mentioned very kindly, my background is in evolutionary biology and plant ecology. I started off doing a master's asking the question, how do communities of plants come to be on the landscape? Why is it that we see what we see on the landscape? Why do certain plants co-occur where they do and others don't? And then I did some research at McMaster University asking a very similar question, but I was asking, how do we reassemble a landscape that's been damaged, and how do we bring the right plants together at the right time in the right way in order to recreate plant communities that we've destroyed and removed from the landscape? And in doing this, we studied the response of insect communities to restoration, and we found that yes, improving native plant diversity on the landscape does increase insect diversity, particularly bees. I just want to tell a really quick story here about this cool bee we found. This is a parasitic bee, and you might think that's weird and probably bad, but it's actually an indicator of ecosystem health. Like a cuckoo bird, this bee can only lay its eggs in the nests of other bees. And so for this parasite to thrive, it needs to have healthy populations of its host bees also present. And those host bees rely on native plants. So this is a kind of a really cool way that we can monitor and judge how well our restoration is doing. And in the past decade or so, I've had the great privilege and pleasure of being part of restoring about 200 hectares at this point of mostly grassland habitat in southern Ontario, usually through seed related methods. And this is wonderful work, but it begs the question, where does all of this seed come from? Where do you find enough seed to do 200 hectares, let alone thousands of hectares? So one method is through what's known a regional seed increase, or a regional seed cooperative, or simply seed farming. This is a method of going out onto the landscape, collecting small amounts of representative wild seed, and then scaling it up agriculturally in one place, on one farm, in one orchard, in order to have increased quality and quantity of seed available to do restoration. And this approach hits kind of 4 sweet spots. You are able to capture local genetics, local adaptation in the wild plant populations. Because you're selecting from a broad range and bringing them together, you're able to increase genetic diversity. And like I mentioned, this increases the availability of seed and makes it more affordable. So this is a great approach to growing more seed to do more restoration work and to bring native plants back to the landscape. Ultimately, it boils down to horticulture at a large scale. So gardening at a large scale is farming in many ways. So I spent about 8 years working with the St. William's Nursery and Ecology Centre in southwestern Ontario. I believe Canada's largest native seed producer. I'll let you read one of my favorite quotes from naturalist Aldo Leopold. And not only did we cultivate about 100 acres of native wildflower that served as habitat and a source of seed, but we were also able to directly grow and see the results of our efforts other types of biodiversity besides plants. The number of native insects that could be seen in the nursery was just amazing compared to the surrounding landscape. In many ways, a diverse and large native plant nursery represents a very healthy ecosystem, and it represents an ecosystem that's no longer reflected in a lot of parts of southern Canada. So many years ago, I was involved in growing and harvesting bulk seed for restoration. This is me. Here are some of the crops that we grew. The St. William's Nursery and Ecology Centre is in Norfolk County, the sand plain of southwestern Ontario, which is one of the most biodiverse regions of Canada. And we grew about 300 different species on any given year, many of them in these large outdoor gardens or orchards or farm rows, depending on the size of the crop. And in some cases, these crop rows, these orchards, we're the largest representative populations of that species. And in some cases, in the wild, they had become extinct, extirpated, since they were cultivated in the nursery. And so these nursery populations kind of are the last place that you can see some of these plants. Here's just some fantastic images, I think, of the opportunity and the possibility of these spaces, what they represent for ecosystem restoration, and for growing habitat for wildlife. They're also beautiful. It is the most regenerative industry and business that you could think of, because we're growing more habitat, we're growing more ecological goods and services. It's part of a regenerative economy. But these spaces are also incredible community hubs. They could potentially serve as locations for art classes. Imagine your wedding photos sustainably taken around a wildflower farm, a concert, something like that. These spaces are multi-dimensional and have many, many values. So like I said, I did much of this work for a nursery, a large restoration nursery, but I've also done some work with the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance, which is a very grassroots NGO in Southern Ontario that partners with other groups to do similar kind of seed scaling up on the ground. So we work with local conservation partners to identify uncommon species on the landscape that are needed for restoration, or sometimes are needed for gardening projects. And we work with landowners to access land and water, often to irrigate our plantings, to scale these plants up in order to provide more seed to those conservation partners for the great work that they're doing. So this is an example of the local seed strategy work that I've been doing for almost 10 years now. We're calling it the Between the Lakes strategy, in recognition of the Between the Lakes Treaty in the Hamilton, Niagara, Norfolk, Haldimand region from 1795. And we've got 4 official partners, but this initiative is growing. And the reason that sometimes a not-for-profit approach can be better is because growing native plants from seeds and scaling them up is sometimes a lot more expensive than growing or scaling up non-native plants, annuals, cultivars, that sort of thing. And this is because the seeds ultimately come from the wild. And in southwestern Ontario, which is the most fragmented and human populated region of Canada, some of these healthy plant populations are very few and far between. They're scattered on the landscape, and it takes a lot of effort and coordination to collect these plants, to get enough seed, to actually scale them up and plant them back onto the landscape. So this additional work comes with a cost. Now, I'm just going to sort of take a few moments actually, and spend some time with plants themselves. I just want to sort of talk about some of the uncommon plants that I've had the pleasure of working with, and talk about their seeds a little bit. Just as an example of what goes into a plant conservation approach to growing native plants. So this is an American sycamore. It's an uncommon tree in the floodplains of southwestern Ontario. It's one of the first seeds you collect in the year, because the winter storms knock the seed balls out of the tree. This is one of those plants where you have to travel an hour, sometimes 2 hours between populations to get enough representative seed, enough genetic diversity from the landscape to provide good quality trees that are then going to be used in restoration. But it's worth it. It's a beautiful tree. It's one of the tallest trees in Ontario, but it can be time consuming to collect. This is a fairly common shrub, but it's hard to see, and the berries fall off very quickly. Canada fly honeysuckle. So I've included a few notes on these slides if you'd like to. If you're in Southern Ontario, a lot of these will apply from, I guess, Windsor up to the Ottawa region. But this plant It's easy to spot when it's flowering, but harder to spot when the seeds are ripe. They turn red before June 1st, and the birds love them. So it's hard to get a large number of those seeds and to collect them sustainably. Twin leaf is a rare plant in southern Ontario, but it's not very well protected. The populations themselves are often very large, but they're spread out on the landscape. So to get genetically diverse representative seed, you have to travel large distances. It also takes a few years to grow these plants from seed and can be slow to provide back to gardeners or to the restoration industry. Bluebells are in a similar state in southern Ontario where they occur. It's usually in large numbers, but it's best practice for seed conservation to collect from multiple populations. So again, you have to drive here and there and everywhere, and access is often very hard. The highest quality floodplains in southern Ontario, unfortunately, are often not in conserved areas. They're on privately owned land. Crabapple is one of my favorites. In spring, a lot of spring flowering shrubs disappear after they flower, so you have to spend time first driving around scouting them. Often these plants will occur only one or two every few kilometers, and then you have to drive around again and find them when they're ripe. So this is the largest one that I know. I'm just showing you some of my favorite plants here. And this plant, I believe, has only survived as long as it has is because it's on a fence row of a pioneer cemetery, which is probably has not been disturbed in many years, 100 years. So you probably know about elm trees. They suffer from Dutch elm disease. Southern Ontario actually has 3 different species of elm, and they're all at risk. The rock elm is the rarest, and this photo represents the total collection of the red or slippery elm and rock elm in the Between the Lakes region in about 2016. So pretty sad. These species don't often produce seed, and getting a sustainable amount means that you're often left with only 50 or fewer seeds to work with. We also work with a few different milkweeds. They are fortunately very easy to grow from seed and pretty quick to grow from seed. Some of them, though, are fairly uncommon on the landscape. So in order to maintain genetic diversity, we have to drive around and collect from many populations. Sometimes we don't even have that luxury. This is a green milkweed, and there's only a handful of populations in the region, and they each only have a handful of plants or fewer every year that flower. So we're working with, almost extinct populations of plants. Asters and goldenrods are fantastic for gardeners to work with. Like milkweeds, they're easy to grow from seed, and they support all kinds of beneficial insects. This is the only one I'm really going to mention. You can handle them all the same, and I'm going to go into those details pretty soon. It's a silver rod, so a really cool, small, white-flowered goldenrod. I am going to wrap up pretty soon talking about my favorite plants, but I have to mention legume plants. So no garden is complete, and no conservation project is complete without considering legumes. They are the 3rd most diverse plant family on the world. They all are able to fix nitrogen and therefore benefit the plants around them, improve soil fertility. In southern Ontario alone, there are 37 species of native legumes, and most of them are rare where they occur. Fortunately, legumes, like beans, are very easy to grow from seed, most of them. So here are a few of my favorite examples. I don't really have time to dive into them as much as I'd like. I did spend some time at the nursery when I was growing seed, working with the wild blue lupin. And I just want to give a shout out to the Nature Conservancy of Canada for doing excellent work in the Norfolk County region to restore lupin in a massive way on the landscape in order to bring back the Carner blue butterfly, which relies on this plant to complete its life cycle. So this is a photo of a restoration that was completed with seed. This is my favorite native legume. It's a very rare little vetch. I'm sure you're familiar with all kinds of weedy vetches that climb over things. This is a wood vetch. It blooms at the end of spring. It's pretty much rare everywhere that it occurs in Canada, but not protected in any way. There's really no effort to restore it on the landscape. However, there are some plants that are protected, and I do want to acknowledge that there are government funded programs and lots of scientists working on restoring some native plants from seed. So a shout out to those folks. These are not plants that I've grown from seed myself, but I've had the pleasure of monitoring them. So this is a legume. I think it's Canada's rarest legume, the goat's rue. It only has one population in Southern Ontario. So a lot of rare plants, even though they're rare on the landscape, they can actually be cultivated quite easily from seed. And these are examples that I'm showing you. The bird's foot violet is available on the market, I guess, in the garden trade, but I would caution you because these are either imported plants, which might be full of disease, or maybe other, messing with genetics of wild populations, or more likely they represent illegally poached cultivated plants. And I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but I just want you to be cautious when you're buying rare plants from the nursery. This is another species at risk, has one population in Ontario, but it grows like a weed. It is a mint, so you know how it grows, and it grows very easily from seed. This could be used on every roadside in Ontario, and I'm trying desperately to convince people that I know in the government to relax some of these regulations. But its conservation status is stable. It's being grown in a couple of different gardens as a backup. This is a fantastic rare plant, the green dragon. It can be grown very easily from seed. It's actually the giant cousin of Jack in the Pulpit. So this is my transition into seed collection and cleaning methods. So this stuff is maybe a little more technical and dry. I will leave a copy of this presentation with Sarah to share. I'm also going to share a few references. Sometimes all these details are better, on your own, at your own pace, on your own time, to really absorb the information and figure out what you need to know for the work that you're trying to do in your garden. So I'll try to keep it brief. Here we go. Jack in the Pulpit, I mentioned, very easy to grow from seed. Find one good population, you've got hundreds of seeds there, easy to clean in a blender. You just tape the blades of the blender, will clean all the pulp off the seed and plunk them in the garden next spring. So I'm going to go through a bunch of easy methods, start to finish, what you need to be a seed collector and to conserve plants, native plants and their seeds. So here are some kind of rules to consider before you get into this work. Ask before you collect, especially if you're in the wild anywhere, in a park or on somebody's land. Check with other people. Sometimes, even if they're not species at risk, regionally rare plants, people are collecting from those populations. They are trying to recover them. They do rely on those seeds maybe for their business. So just, check around with the other native plant folks in your community first. Spend some time researching the plants that you want to grow. Make sure that you're prepared. These are living things. They are precious little baby plants. So handle them, be prepared. Handle them with care and be prepared. When you're out collecting, even if you're in a large population and it's a common plant, you shouldn't collect more than like 10% of the available seed. Different resources say different numbers, but keep it moderate, right? Again, these are living things and you're trying to help the plants. You don't want to take too much. And try to avoid collecting every year from the same patches. This will definitely deteriorate the quality of that plant population. So try to collect, if you can, only from populations that have 200 plants or more. And this applies only to wildflowers and grasses, not necessarily to trees. It's also really important to track your collections because you need to make decisions about, how you're handling your plants, how old those seeds are, where they come from, when you collected them, that kind of thing. And maybe if you forget them in a drawer 20 years from now, someone will try to grow your seeds and they'll really want to know those things. Okay, if you are growing seeds in your garden, you're growing lots of native plants in your garden, you want to give seeds to friends and stuff, that's a bit different. You could probably collect all of those seeds because they kind of have a destiny, that you've given them a purpose. They're going to be grown. Each seed is going to be given the best chance it can by your gardening friends, for example, or by you in your own garden. So these rules don't necessarily apply to your own garden. Okay, so the tools that you'll need to be a basic seed collector. This is all you really need to get into the game. You need some screens or sieves. You can find these at hardware stores. They're available online from starting at about $30 for a set, all the way up to many hundreds of dollars for a professional geology screening set. They all basically do the same thing. You can also use a variety of screens that you buy at the kitchen supply store. You can make your own with window screen and wooden boxes if you're handy like that. The point is, you need a variety of sizes of screens. You also need some bags, some plastic containers, small Tupperware, that kind of stuff, and some planting materials. So perlite, vermiculite, some peat moss, some kind of sterile planting medium. You also need a bunch of old towels. Just generally, it can be a little dusty and sometimes a little bit messy, but not too bad. Soap, bleach, having a good large sink to use is great. You'll need that, and a fridge probably, or at least a shed outside to do your cold stratification. So those are pretty basic. And one step up from that, you probably want to start storing your seed not in plastic bags, but in jars. So invest in some good glass jars if that's gonna if it's gonna be sort of a regular hobby for you. Like I mentioned with Jack in the Pulpit, a blender can be really handy for extracting seed. Just make sure you tape those blades or blunt them in some other way. I use a shop vac probably most often out of all of these tools. It's really good for separating seed from debris as a stage before you screen. So a shop vac can go a long way, especially with really fluffy seed. And I'll give you an example in a minute. Leaf mulchers, similarly, very simple function, chopping up heads of seed. You do lose a small percentage of your seed when you do that, like maybe 10%. But if you've collected a large quantity of seed, enough that you need a leaf mulcher to clean, it's definitely worth it. So for example, bush clover I've shown here, they are like stuffed in these really like little envelopes, these tight little envelopes and heads, and the only efficient way to get them out is to mulch them. And you get a lot of good clean seed that's not damaged at the end of the process. All right, if you're thinking of maybe like going into business or like doing this as a side gig, as maybe, a semi-professional seed cleaner, do consider tools like a cement mixer or a rock tumbler. This is important for tree seed in particular, some shrub seed, crab apples, things like that. A microscope is handy. It's handy even if you're an amateur, but if you want to get into business, you do have to assure some sort of seed quality in the product that you're distributing. So you do need a microscope to be able to assess that properly. And also, I would say, in order to assure seed quality is, sellable, you'll need some sort of air, like an aspirator. You can purchase very high quality professional grade ones. There are also YouTube videos to show you how to build one using a shop vac and some plexiglass and supplies you can get at Home Depot. So it's not totally inaccessible, but what it does is help separate viable seed from all of the other dust and chaff and non-viable seed using basically weight, air and gravity. And then, other professional tools that the pros use. There are tools that will deshell, dehusk. There's walnut grinders, things like that. Combines, all kinds of agricultural and sometimes industrial kitchen equipment, industrial juicers, for example. But that's another story, maybe. If you are cleaning your own seed at home in the kitchen, here are some tools. This is what I do every summer in the backyard and in my kitchen. Don't collect seed before it's ripe. Most seed will not ripen off the stem. Some will. Mostly I'm thinking grasses. You can pick them a little bit unripe, but for the most part, wait until they're ripe. And that will be mostly a visual cue. The pod will dry out and turn brown and lose all color, or if it's a berry, it will turn bright red or pink or purple or whatever. There's very obvious cues. Each species is a little bit different though. It's always best to store your seed at room temperature for a couple days. Don't put it into the fridge right away. That can kind of shock it and kind of mess with the humidity. Also, don't leave it in your car in the sea or in the sun while you're out doing something else. That will kill it. It's alive. So yeah, in the short term, storage can be really anything on plates and bins and paper bags, just open with airflow at room temperature, even for a couple months. For most species, that's okay. You can store them long term, sealed, dry in your fridge or in a fairly cool environment. The cooler and drier they are, the longer they'll last generally. Most seeds do not like going back and forth between being dry and wet, or hot and cold, hot and cold. That will kill them or cause them to germinate while they're in storage, and that will kill them too. So this is, there's exception to every rule, but these rules apply to seeds that are considered to be orthodox seeds in their germination and storage. A lot of spring ephemeral plants, woodland plants, have different rules. They are unorthodox seeds. So be cautious, especially if you're collecting woodland ephemeral seeds. So that image there, sorry, that's just washing soap berries in water. And that's the soap that comes with the lather. Just rub the berries on the screen in some water. All of the pulp will kind of float to the top with the suds, and the viable ripe seeds will sink and just drain off the water. And here is a photo of that soap berry or buffalo berry. And the easiest way to collect these, because the fruits are very tiny, is to put a tarp underneath of them and to just shake the berries onto a tarp. So I also want to introduce you to this concept of winnowing. It's a very good way to get small batches of seed very clean. And the reason that you want your small batches of seed for garden propagation clean is that because all of the non-seed material, the non-living material, can go moldy when you put it into stratification, and that will kill your seeds. So it's good to get your seeds as clean as you possibly can before you put them into storage or before you put them into stratification. And one way to do that is to winnow them. And that's simply sort of using either your breath or the wind, tossing them in the air to at a certain angle for that air and that wind to carry the light, fluffy material away, leaving the heavier seeds in your container. So there's a few videos online. You kind of have to see it being done. It's more of a hands-on workshop type thing, but check it out. It's easy to practice on your own. Like I mentioned, if you have a large quantity of fluffy seed that you want to clean, way too much to winnow on your own, a shop vac can help, especially for milkweed. I find this really handy for cleaning milkweed pods. If you collect them and they've already cracked open, they're fully ripe, and you think, how am I going to do this without getting fluff everywhere? Just suck all that fluff out with a shop vac. And the vortex, the spinning of the air inside the shop vac kind of separates the seed from the light fluff. And then you just sort of screen it off at the end. And it gets pretty clean. So again, most plants that I have worked with can be processed using really simple hands-on method. Your best tools are your fingers and a little bit of water, I guess. So all kinds of berries, that's the simplest way to clean them, is to just crush them over a sieve in some water. Usually the pulps will float, the skins will float, and the seeds will sink. If you are working with fruits that are edible for people, and you're certain about where those fruits came from, definitely try to save that juice, save that pulp. I make strawberry juice every year, and I save my seeds and give them away to my friends. So I've talked about stratification. You might know what it is, maybe you don't know what it is. I'm going to go through my easy method of stratifying wildflower seeds. A lot of native plant seeds need to go through a winter period, so you can leave them outside to stratify naturally over winter, which just, stratification just means cold and moist for a period of time. That can work outside. It can also not work. You don't have control over the temperature and the humidity. Sometimes squirrels and other animals can get in your way. It works for a lot of people if you can protect them. But for me, I find it a lot easier to use one of my vegetable crispers, frankly, is dedicated over winter to stratifying seed. So all you need is a Ziploc, a sealable container of some sort, some of that sterile media that I mentioned, usually like a potting soil. You can even use shredded paper towel, and your fridge. So you want your medium to be ever so slightly moist. You don't want it dripping wet. You want to have squeezed all the moisture out of it as you possibly can. And then you want it mixed thoroughly, about 1-to-1 volume with the seed that you have. And every species is different, but once you seal it in your bag, put it in the fridge for anywhere between 1, 6, 8 weeks. Every species is different. And once they are finished their stratification period, bring them right outside, right under a direct grow light, and get them going. Don't leave them in stratification for too long. Some of them might start to germinate in the fridge, and they never fully recover from that. It's hard. So like I said, every species is different. Some require no stratification at all. Some have a very short, basic cold period. Some have a longer period. I've listed out some species here, and we don't have time to go through all that. But some species are very, very difficult to handle. Like I said, they have to be, soaked in sulfuric acid, like Kentucky coffee tree. Some seeds need to be given a boiling water bath in order to break their seed coat. Some species need to go through several periods of cold and then warm and then cold and then warm in order for them to germinate. They'll grow a root first and they'll grow a shoot years later. So, do your research. One of my favorite resources for, I guess, Eastern Canada is this website here, wildplantsfromseed.com. But also the Prairie Moon website is fantastic too. I'll leave a bunch of resources with Sarah at the end. Here's an example of one of the trickier species that I've ever tried to grow, and not because the seeds are hard to germinate, but because they need a host plant to germinate with. So this is a wood betony, and it's a hemiparasite, meaning that it can photosynthesize, but it gets a lot of its nutrients from host plants that it grows off of. And the seeds will germinate, but they'll only survive past the one leaf stage if they have another plant to leach off of. So, like I said, everybody is different. Sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're complex. Here are some other great resources. The first is an international database that was created by the Society of Ecological Restoration, their seed information database. And there isn't one thing that I've searched here that I haven't been able to find. And this will give you information on collection timings, storage, stratification details. And here's another reference, primarily for Northern Ontario, Quebec, but it does apply more broadly to Eastern Canada. And a few other websites there. If you're in Southwestern Ontario, the Native Plants of the Carolinian Zone is a great database to check out. And I've already mentioned Wild Plants from Seed. Okay, so it is autumn and we are getting, almost autumn, sorry, but we're getting to that point where there's a lot of seeds ripe and you might want to start collecting some seeds out in the wild. If you're in Ontario or anywhere within the range of the ash tree, I want you to check out the Forest Gene Conservation Association. They have a really cool program where you can report healthy ash trees that are full of seed, and you don't even have to collect them. They will send somebody out to collect those seeds, and they will bank them long term. As you probably know, ash trees suffer from emerald ash borer and are slowly disappearing on the landscape. So it's important that you report healthy ash seeds if you find them. It's a great time to start collecting berries from various native shrubs, brownleaf dogwood. This is a viburnum, an arrowwood. This is my favorite viburnum. There's about 5 native viburnums in this part of the world, and this is my favorite, the maple-leaved, or I laugh and I say it's the maple-flavored viburnum, because it comes in these amazing shades of like copper and orange and amber in the fall. Really spectacular. Also, fall is a great time for witch hazel. So this plant not only ripens in the fall, but it also blooms in the fall. It takes a full year for its seeds to ripen. So when you go to collect the seed, the flowers for next year are already in bloom. And these ripen very quickly during that kind of last hot, dry period at the end of October. And the pods crack and the seeds fly out. We measured 15 meters once. So people say plants don't move. They certainly do. Here are some other just beautiful native plants to collect in this part of the world come autumn. Now, I probably don't have too much time to get into the seed strategy, but I do want to acknowledge that native plants have a lot of co-benefits. They're not only habitat, they also feed us. They also provide solutions to climate change, such as carbon sequestration. And as I mentioned, growing native plants and producing native plant materials is a really sustainable job. And I believe that this is one of the greenest industries in the world, the kind of industry of growing more life and growing life a little bit better. So Canadian Wildlife Federation has spent the last year focusing on how to bring support to the native plant industry in order to meet some of our goals related to restoration. All of these goals which Canada has around, monarch conservation, to the bond challenge, carbon capture targets. These all rely on native plants in one way or another. And our best estimate is that Canada produces about 1% of what's needed to meet these commitments annually, which is a huge gap. And what's more is that the restoration that is being done in Canada and around the world is not really restoring the same level of biodiversity that's being lost. And so can we really call this restoration if we're ignoring most of the plants that make up these habitats? And I am a big plant nerd, but I'm also a big dinosaur nerd. And if you haven't read Jurassic Park, I feel that there are wonderful parallels between developing a national plant conservation policy and the book and the film Jurassic Park. So if you haven't seen it, Jurassic Park, yes, it's about dinosaurs, but it's also about a botanist that nobody listens to. And she says right from the beginning, you guys don't know what you're doing. There are poisonous plants here, and these plants are alive, and you can't discount them or discredit them or ignore them. And that was the takeaway that I took from Jurassic Park. But that's also the takeaway here, is that plants are being ignored in conservation. Botany programs are disappearing from universities, and our ability just to be able to identify plants is disappearing. And this can be a big problem in reaching our sustainable development goals and reaching our restoration goals and reaching any of our goals related to wildlife conservation. How can you help anything else if you don't help plants first? I believe a lot of it starts with the nature, or with the language that we use to talk about plants in relation to nature. These are not climate solutions so much as they are ecosystems. They don't have to be a solution to anything to be valued. I'm just kind of joking around now, but people forget. I think a lot of people forget, maybe not gardeners on the call, but a lot of folks that are decision makers forget what plants do for us, and that they are the only living thing that can passively sequester carbon and do so while feeding us and providing us with shade and homes. So I do want to acknowledge that there are other groups in Canada addressing the seed supply issue. The National Tree Seed Center has recently published a report, and they comment on the 2 billion tree program. 2 billion trees alone will require 11 billion seeds. Where do these seeds come from? How are we going to get there? So if you'd like to be involved in the National Native Seed Strategy process, we are collecting feedback. We're collecting ideas from all kinds of native plant experts on what you think priorities should be for funding, for projects, that kind of thing. We have an engagement survey. You can use your phone, scan this QR code. I can also include a link, and you can take our survey. So we have a few working groups. Like I said, we've been meeting for over a year now. The project does wrap up early next year. So if you do work with native plants in a big way, we'd love to hear from you, and let us know as soon as you can. I don't have time for any of this stuff. Okay, so I have over prepared. I hope that gives you enough information to start maybe collecting some native plant seeds, maybe growing more native plants in your garden, and maybe helps you see plants as wildlife as well. So I think there is enough time for some questions, some Q&A. Thanks so much again to Sarah for inviting me to speak, and for everyone who joined us tonight.
Thanks, Stefan. That was awesome. I love playing with seeds, collecting seeds. It's a bit addictive after a while, but I've never done it on the scale that you're talking about. And it's a lot to learn, but you've shared it in a very easy to understand manner. So thank you. And as Stefan said, and I said, we'll include links to support you guys even more fully right across the country. And on that note, before I get into the questions, I wanted to say we do have a resource called a native plant supplier list. So for all the different provinces across the country, all the different native plant suppliers that we know of, some of them are 100%, some of them only sell us a percentage, but we do have that information online, as well as an encyclopedia and other resources. So we'll include that with the email. But getting to the questions now, then there are about 11 that I see right now. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to help with the first one, Stefan. It's specific to mugwort. I'd like to kill an entire hydro corridor worth of mugwort. The internet suggests that the only way to send mugwort back to hell is with herbicide. Do you agree with this? Is there any other way of clearing these fields so I can plant native seeds? If the mugwort is mowed, can I scatter native plant seeds and hope that the native plants overtake the mugwort? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know with the right-of-way project system kind of work with using native seeds and different ways to try to clear the space for them. I don't know if you have any information on that.
Sure. So there are native mugworts. That could be any species. I'm not sure where you are, but assuming that it is a weedy one you don't want there, my understanding is most of them are annuals as well. So if you do mow, or at least prevent like maybe 2 generations from going to seed, and then plant in some larger perennial natives that might be able to compete with it, like longer lived perennials, that might be one approach other than using herbicide. But unfortunately, as my friend always says, it's poison or madness sometimes. We've done a lot to impact these ecosystems, and it's going to take just as much effort to restore them. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Another one is, where are all of the native plant species seeds available for each province and zone? Most wildflower seed packets do not contain native seeds, which is very true. You've got to be so careful with those packets. Usually, I've only come across one company that actually had native seeds to like that batch. I guess it was province, I think. Yeah, so any thoughts on that, Stefan?
Sure. Every province, every region is different, and they have different industries. Some, like Southern Ontario, Alberta, they have associations of growers, native plant growers, that grow source identified, local, regionally collected native plants. There is no certification in Canada. There is no regulation in Canada around selling or labeling of native plants. So some of these associations, growers associations, are your best resources. Also, turn to your conservation authority or watershed authority or equivalent. Sometimes they will have resources. But I think, Sarah, you mentioned a list of native plant suppliers that we have as well, right?
Yeah, and we'll send that link out as well. Yeah, great. Perhaps it will be addressed, but just in case, what strategies are used to control invasives? Seems like a full-time job in nearby parks. Yeah.
Strategies to control invasives. Yeah.
Mm.
I like to think of it as untoasting toast. It's almost impossible because like the system has changed. You're at a new threshold. So in some very highly degraded urban parks, for example, urban areas, the best you can do is keep the super invasives at bay and try to introduce some of the most robust native plants that you can. Um, yeah, sometimes you can't untoast toast.
Mm, okay. And someone's asking, do you use GIS in collection of your data?
Personally, I use Google Maps. And I find that's the easiest for me, and it usually works wherever I am in Southern Ontario. So different organizations, different nurseries will certainly track where their seed is coming from, but they might use a different program.
Okay. And someone's asking, where is that lupin restoration project that you were mentioning? Yeah, the beautiful picture to help the
Yeah,
Carner butterfly.
yeah. So broadly, the Long Point region, the Walsingham Sand Plain in southwestern Ontario, Norfolk County, southern Norfolk County. There are quite a number, a couple dozen maybe, um, parcels of land that the Nature Conservancy has restored, along with other groups, the local conservation authority, and many of them include lupin. So it's not just one place. If you go visit those prairie restorations, and they're all very well labeled, the signage is great. The parking isn't great, so there's often roadside parking only, but yeah, the Long Point Sand Basin.
Okay, and actually the next question ties in with it, and it's a good one. It's asking, is the Carner blue butterfly back? And just a quick backstory for those that aren't familiar with this. In Canada, this tiny, beautiful species of butterfly was extirpated from where it was living in Canada. It means it's not extinct, it's not gone from the planet. It's just was no longer in Canada. But when you mentioned that restoration project, I wondered that too. Have they managed to either reintroduce or have the Carner blue butterflies come back on their own?
They haven't come back on their own. There are researchers that monitor these populations and other lupin populations every year for all butterflies. They basically do full butterfly survey, and there have been no Carners reported yet. I've heard, but this is just rumor, that eventually the idea is to actively reintroduce them. They are actively reintroducing the model dusky wing butterfly to different parts of Ontario. And I think they're using that as a bit of a model. Maybe I'm speculating for the Carner blue, but I wouldn't be surprised that, in the next 10 years or so, government officially supports a plan for Carner recovery.
Okay, thanks. And then another question, where are a few good reputable places to find or purchase native plants to grow? So that might have been listed before I mentioned the native plant supplier list. And I think everyone that Stefan knows of is probably at this point on that list. So we'll definitely send that out to you, but not sure if you have any thoughts on that as well, Stefan.
I only really know the folks in Southern Ontario. Like, I'm familiar with businesses elsewhere, but the folks that I worked with in Southern Ontario, the Guyana Nursery at Six Nations is fantastic. Native plants at Claremont outside of Toronto. St. William's Nursery, I used to work for them. There's native plants and trees in Windsor. Yeah, there's a wonderful list that's going to be circulated.
And one thing I would recommend to you is again, when you see the list and you click on the name, look to see the percentage, because they tell us if they're 100% native, then you know they really care, they're really knowledgeable, that's their passion. They're going to have a lot of great information for you. If they've got maybe 20 or 30%, they might still be having some information and care, but you can also tell those that are really, really knowledgeable and perhaps have been studying it as a career. You might be able to differentiate with the percentages of what the nursery is selling. Let's see, can I harvest the seeds in the spring once they have been through the winter before you spread them versus the fall, for example? What will work best?
Most of the seeds will be eaten. I hate to say. So for like wild bergamot, for example, the seeds ripen September-ish. If you wait until December to collect the seeds, you'll only have like 10% of them left. So all kinds of animals love native plant seeds. That's what they've evolved to eat, right? So I would say collect them shortly after they're ripe. Also, you lose seed in wind and rain. And my experience is that when you go back to a plant that even has sort of a head or a capsule that would hold on to seed, most of this viable seed is gone in the spring.
Okay. And if you're interested in getting into conservation work with native plants like you, what education or experience would you need? What do you call the job or volunteer work for searching purposes?
Sure. Okay. I would say
Great question.
like horticulture, just work with plants and gardens, volunteer your neighbors, your aunts, your uncles, whoever has a garden, help them. That's where you learn about plants. You learn about plants in the woods, join a naturalist club, go on some hikes. Sometimes there's field botany groups, things like that. I don't use INAT. People find it handy. I don't. Like formal education wise, I have lots of like science training. That doesn't help you learn how to grow plants or collect seed or things like that. I guess that helps with the bigger picture and some of the other like, policy stuff, economy stuff, climate change. But really, I would say a solid horticultural background and being able to read your landscape, like your local landscape, become very familiar with the ecosystems in your area. And there's lots of ways to do that.
I like that you mentioned the Field Naturalist Club, because a lot of Field Naturalist Club do have youth chapters, although perhaps the person asking is much older than that, the age of a youth chapter, but they're awesome. But even again, these Field Naturalist Clubs, I've been a member of a couple of them over the years, and there's all kinds of people in them. Retired experts in trees, retired experts in that, or currently active experts in this, or people who just studied it on the side. And there's so much information to get from the walks they have, the talks they have, and then just chatting with the people themselves. And master gardeners, I find, are now moving towards being more and more environmentally minded and native plant minded. So they might even have like some interest, because there's programs you can take to study to become a master gardener. I don't know what you know of that, Stefan, but that might be. I love that you're saying also just get in the garden and get that experience. Get that experience.
Yeah.
Um,
I was a Toronto master gardener. I didn't maintain my status, but I was briefly. Yeah, master gardeners are great wealths of information. I just wanted to advance to acknowledge the folks that have taught me and helped me with my plant stuff over the years. So yeah, find a mentor, find a person that you can go for a hike with and can teach you stuff, and who likes you, who likes to teach you and likes to spend time with you. So yeah, shout out to these wonderful women in my life.
and I'm going to say also, I'll see if I can think of some titles to include in our email for books, because nowadays there are a lot of great books. You can get like Lorraine Johnson, sort of like the pioneer years ago with getting native plant books out there, but there's a bunch more now. I've had a bunch of authors on or different webinar series, so that could be useful too. I guess I should move on. So where to report healthy ash again, please?
Oh, it's called the Forest Gene Conservation Association.
And how about we put that link in the email too?
Sure.
Okay. I've made a
Or
note of it. We can.
yeah. FGCA. They primarily operate in Ontario, maybe southern Quebec a bit too.
Okay, and then wrapping up here, what did you mean about garden plants aren't for biodiversity?
I don't think I said that. I think maybe that was the latter picture. And what I meant was the garden plants. You don't have to be as concerned about taking all of the seed from your garden plants because presumably you're taking all that seed in order to grow each and every seed somewhere else in your garden or in somebody else's garden, which is different than going to a wild population that needs to maintain itself by having seeds scatter naturally in its natural environment. So you have to limit your collection when you're collecting from wild plants, but not when you're collecting from your own garden plants, unless you want to make sure that that seed is there as wildlife food. That would maybe be the only reason to restrain yourself. I think I understood your question.
Okay,
I
and
hope
then does it negatively affect seeds to store them in plastic baggies, i.e. Ziplocs? I'm very mixed on this. Plastic, paper, glass. What's the best for space saving and longevity?
long-term glass jarred, sealed, as long as your seeds are appropriately dried, not completely dried out so they're dead, but appropriately dried, like 10% moisture content. It varies. Ziploc baggies do the trick 9 times out of 10 for medium term, so like 1 to 3 year storage. Do check on them, every couple of years if you're going to store them that long. Paper bags or just out in a bin are fine for a few months, especially I'll say like grassland species. So sunny wildflowers, grasses, things like that can be stored dry at room temperature for quite a while, usually.
Okay, and I think this is the person that was talking about mugwort before, and she's saying it's not an annual. If you mow it for years, it will still come back. If you pull it, a new shoot will come from each broken root. So I'm not sure if you have a thought on that or if that was basically what you had before.
I'm not familiar with controlling that plant myself.
Yeah.
It could be a case of you need to use an herbicide. There might be something that can outcompete it. I'm
Mm.
not sure.
Okay. I live in Prince Edward County, and there are many unused large fields as farmers move out and non-farmers purchase the land. Is there help for people wanting to convert their land to native grasslands and meadows?
There is some help. I would say it's scattered. Again, contact your local conservation authority or watershed authority, something like that.
Mm.
Sometimes I know, like CWF, for example, has a program in southwestern Ontario that supports landowners to create monarch butterfly habitat, wildflower meadows, things like that. So look around. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head other than that.
Okay, thanks. I think it's just 3 or 4 more. What are your views on guerrilla gardening tactics like seed bombs to green blank spaces with native plants?
Sure. I mean, there's a cost benefit analysis that I would run through in my head, and I hope you are too. So yeah, if you're using great, local species, things are going to actually thrive in the random place that you're throwing them, which can be done. Yeah, I just hate seed going to waste, so to speak. But yeah, if you are very certain that you're using appropriate plants and yeah, go for it. I do a little bit of that when I'm out hiking. I guess I'll collect grass seed and scatter it about, help the plants a little bit. But yeah, go for it.
Okay. When it comes to gardening to support biodiversity, how important is it to use seeds that are genetically diverse, local ecotype, source identified, and straight species, brackets with no risk of hybridization, when we have existing native plants in the garden that don't have the full background on? That was a long one. Do you want me to read it again, or do you want
Yeah,
to?
could you repeat at least the second part or the whole thing maybe?
Okay, so when it comes to gardening to support biodiversity, how important is it to use seeds that are genetically diverse? local ecotype, source identified, and straight species brackets with no risk of hybridization when we have existing native plants in the garden that we don't have the full background on.
Right. So if you have existing mystery, potential hybrid, native type things, maybe of like, okay, I'll finish my sentence. Maybe avoid planting the straight species, but it only really matters if you are intending to then take those seeds and plant them out in a natural area again somewhere. That would be the only major impact that could have. I think it's good to have genetically diverse seeds in your garden if you plan to give seeds away, support a local seed network partnership. If you live close to a natural area where those species might occur or might naturally disperse to, I think that's also a good reason to consider source identified local genetics. Yeah, and I guess I will also say in the theme of plants are wildlife too, your garden then becomes a conservation hub for those local populations. So you're not just helping the butterflies and the things that want to eat those plants, but you're helping the plants themselves, right? So yeah.
Okay, and then a few short questions. Have you heard of collecting seed once it goes through a bear or other animal?
I have heard of that. Yes, I just read something about civet coffee, but I also have collected hackberry seed from presumably raccoon droppings. Maybe it was fox. I'm not. I think it was raccoon. Yeah, I've done that. I've heard of folks doing that with bear droppings.
Okay, I know there's one seed, I forget what it was now, one berry that goes through, I think it's the ruffed grouse's digestion or the wild turkey's digestion. It was years ago. And because their digestion was just perfect enough to rough up the seed that when they do, poop it out, that it actually is perfect
Right.
and ready to germinate. So if you don't get it that way, then you do have to take a little bit of sandpaper to rough it up. So it's kind of perfect sometimes.
My favorite example is the Kentucky coffee tree, which is an at-risk tree in Canada. It doesn't germinate in the wild because it needs to be swallowed and digested by an elephant or a mammoth, basically, or some other large animal that's been extinct for a long time. And so you have to soak them in sulfuric acid, 98% sulfuric acid for 24 hours,
Gosh,
or you have to take a knife or whatever and nick off the seed coat.
wow.
Very intense. Yes.
Tamara's asking, silica packs in with the seeds or not? What do you recommend?
I personally don't use them for long-term storage. Maybe, but I wouldn't actually. I don't have a need for that. If you're certain that you've dried them thoroughly at room temperature for a few weeks to a few months, I've never needed them.
Okay. Someone's asking, is the Atlantic Master Gardener Association the closest for the Quebec region? I don't know personally. I'd have to look that up. So I'm not sure if you are aware of that yourself, but yeah. For all the different provinces, I always have to look up because we're national, I always have to keep checking all the different provinces, which one's which. And I don't actually have a list for that one, I'm afraid. So that one you will have to Google. In a small town area, is it better to have large patches of 3 to 6 species or small patches of 20 plus species?
If your goal is to harvest seed for sale or for helping restoration efforts, it's better to have bigger patches of things. Um, you know, it really depends on the species, but I try to aim for at least 25 of the same plant in the same area. If I'm even planning to collect that seed to like give to my friends or to um, plant another generation for my own garden. Because if you are collecting seed smaller populations, you're really not collecting a lot of genetic diversity, and then the plants you put back out on the landscape will all be the same. That matters in some situations. It doesn't matter in others.
Okay. And someone's asking about the best books for Ontario and Quebec Indigenous species, and I'm happy to share some of the ones that I enjoy. And perhaps, Stefan, if you've got any favorites, you can share those now, or you can tell me later, and I can include them in the email.
I use The Shrubs of Ontario, which I believe is out of press.
Oh, is it now?
Maybe I'm
Oh,
wrong, but the ROM published it at one point.
mm,
It's a really great book for shrubs. I use Newcomb's Wildflowers for any kind of like weird, weedy, herbaceous thing that I can't ID. Um, I use that, well, it's very specific for Southern Ontario, but often just whether it's a ministry or a conservation authority, they'll put together databases just of plants, their occurrence, their rarity ranking, maybe which counties they occurred in. So in Southern Ontario, there's a few documents like that. Mike Oldham's Plants of the Carolinian. There's also an MNRF, Vascular Plants of Southern Ontario. They're not necessarily books, but they have all kinds of really valuable information for seed collectors in them.
cool. And I know, for instance, also it's just looking at also species in general too. There are different native plant councils across the country too that have information, and they've got enthusiasts that you could perhaps connect with too locally. Um, so someone's saying choke cherries in our area. Oh, choke cherries in our area germinate better once through a bear's digestive system. That's fun. Should we avoid planting wild lupins if we see non-native lupins around the neighborhood?
Generally, yes. So wild blue lupin would still be considered like a species of conservation concern in Ontario, meaning that all of the plants and all of the seeds have a very direct conservation value. When you plant a known blue lupin next to a non-native blue lupin, there's potential for them to hybridize, and then all the seed you collect from them could be hybrids, but then also some of those hybrids could then escape into the wild, and it becomes very difficult to know which ones are which without testing them and comparing and contrasting. And especially if you are within range of wild blue lupin, I would say try not to grow it near a non-native lupin at all, or don't grow non-native lupin. But if your neighbor has it, then try not to grow it. If that made sense.
Okay.
If that made sense.
And then Carol sort of, I think a bit about the Kentucky coffee tree, I think, because she's saying sanding KC tree seeds and soaking in water for 24 hours works as well. So that's
Yeah.
okay. Kim is saying, you haven't mentioned First People's Keystone Food, Medicine, etc. Could you mention that? Do you have any information on that?
Actually the paper that I started off presentation with is an excellent reference. It's the first attempt to rank the conservation status of all medicinal and edible native plants in Canada. So that's a good reference, I guess, if you'd like to understand which plants are edible, medicinal, and what they're potentially used for. I'll also let you know that the National Tree Seed Center has an Indigenous seed collection program. And so they will provide training, resources, storage facility, testing to any Indigenous community that has need for that. And they will prioritize storage and research on plants that are culturally important, are important to Indigenous foodways, things like that. So they are a great resource as well. And that's a federal program through the National Tree Seed Center. And yeah, I think they're in Halifax. Maybe I'm wrong. They're on the East Coast.
Okay, there's also, I wanted to say, I was trying to look up to find the exact title. I can send the link. We do have also a webinar, brilliant webinar by a very highly respected lady on that too. So I'll include that link as well with the email. Silky lupin, two not in area with cultivars. Oh, I guess leading off of the other question about the lupins, I think. you know about that one, the silky lupin?
No, there
Okay.
are different lupins all across Canada,
Okay.
and my understanding is many of them can hybridize.
Okay. Hello from Halifax. I'd like to know how to properly select the viable seeds from urban and semi-rural tree species like American elm, red maple, oak, aspen, etc. Can you plant the seeds when green, like just collected, or always dry them out before planting? Thanks.
Every species varies. Generally, you don't want to collect them before they're ripe. Um, Oaks, for example, red oaks, you can store cold and mostly dry over winter and then germinate them in the spring. Whereas white oaks and bur oaks, you need to plant them right away in as soon as you collect them in the late fall. Some plants, like if you're collecting maple keys, you can germinate them right away, like plant them right away, and they will germinate. Or if you want to store them and germinate them the following year, you do have to dry them down sort of at room temperature until they look dry, and then store them dry and cold. So it depends on how you plan on handling them. Elm seed, I believe, is the same. You either plant it right away or you have to dry it carefully and then store it over winter to germinate in the spring. Um, if you are in Ontario or nearby in Eastern Canada, check out again the Forest Gene Conservation Association. They have a wonderful book, a resource on tree seed collection. They also provide training courses. You can become a certified tree seed collector with them.
Hmm, cool. So the next few questions are actually back to lupins. So we're asking, how well did the two lupins cross-pollinate? What would the distance between them be? I have a seed contract to grow wild lupins. So I've put them at least 100 meters away from the other ones. I have no problem pulling out the other lupins and only growing the wild ones if they mega cross easily. And you
They
know how
do.
the milkweed crosses with the butterfly milkweed as well after.
Yes. So most large bees, so honeybees, bumblebees, can travel up to 2 kilometers to pollinate. And they also show something called constancy, which means they will fixate, like their day will be just lupin. So if there's any other lupin in the landscape, they'll go from one patch of lupin to the other, even if there's other types of flowers closer by. Um, and that's based on, resource availability and stuff like that. So I would say if there is non-native lupin within 2 kilometers of your lupin, of your suspected lupin, I wouldn't plant it, because you'll never be sure about the seeds.
Okay.
That's yeah.
Yeah, neat, all these different angles, in terms of the pollinators, how far they travel and how they behave. So that's cool to add all those other elements to it. But then she's also asking, do you know how easily the wild milkweed crosses what? Okay, you're saying wild milkweed. I'm assuming you mean common milkweed crosses with the butterfly milkweed, because that's also another wild milkweed in one part of the country anyway.
Yes. So my understanding is butterfly, the orange milkweed, doesn't hybridize with common milkweed.
Mm,
I don't think oh no, Sullivan's milkweed hybridizes with common milkweed. But they also co-occur in the same region. So I
mm,
think they have bloom periods that don't overlap, but
okay.
they can sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you. And that we've come to the end of our questions. A lot of questions, a lot of great questions, and
Good questions. Yeah.
really appreciate you taking the extra time, Stefan, to answer them too. That's very, very kind of you. So how about we wrap it up now, and we'll just say thank you very, very much for a great presentation, some gorgeous photos, and lots of good information. So and thank you everyone for joining us. It's been so great. I love it when people can share and interact like that. And so thank you very much for joining us and your interest. And watch out for the email. It'll be coming in a few days. I'm not quite sure when. I'll get it together. Check your junk folder and your spam folder if it doesn't come in your inbox. But anyway, so have a great evening, everyone. Thank you, Stefan, very much.
Thanks. This was super fun. See you next time.
I'm glad. Take care. Bye bye.
Cheers.